So we're doing chapter 10 today and 11, and I don't know what is going on with the exposure on my phone, but it's a new phone, so I don't know what I'm doing as usual, and that is why I look weird. I'm sorry, I don't know how to fix it. If you have an iPhone, please let me know how to fix it, because I look really like Oompa Loompa-ish or cartoonish or something right now. Anyway, we're just gonna jump right in. Quick recap. I'm in a weird mood today, I'm so sorry. I'm probably gonna laugh a lot. Plus my kids are home and they're gonna be making all kinds of noise in the background, and I apologize for that. Anyway, quick recap. Last week we left off with, Elizabeth was at her aunt's in Meryton, and they were all talking about how they're gonna go to dinner, and the soldiers are all invited. So she knows that Brian, Mr. Wickham, is gonna be there, and she's like, bring it, because I'm just gonna like slay. So that's where we are. Let's just dive right in. Okay, chapter 10. When they entered Aunt Tessa's home, or Aunt Phillips, as Elizabeth struggled to call her, the next evening, the other guests had not yet arrived. They were shown into the drawing room, where they sat with their aunt and uncle and waited for them. Elizabeth found the entire situation extremely strange, to say the least, considering the aunt she knew had never been married. Her uncle was a squat, red-faced man with a receding hairline and a rotund belly that Elizabeth had never seen before in her life. He had a bellowing laugh that was highly contagious, and it wasn't long before she found herself thoroughly enjoying his company, despite her initial ambivalence. As the minutes ticked by, however, Elizabeth became increasingly anxious, moving to the seat closest to the door and listening hard while biting her nails into non-existence. She had stayed awake most of the previous night, going over in her head what she would say to Brian. After several sleepless hours and numerous hypothetical conversations, she had closed her eyes, feeling collected and confident. She was ready. The biggest challenge was going to be remembering to call him Mr. Wickham. However, now that Elizabeth was seconds away from seeing Brian once more, her confidence was rapidly dissolving into panic. What if she took one look at him and froze completely? Or worse, what if her broken brain malfunctioned and she fell victim to a bout of verbal diarrhea? She didn't have long to contemplate the possibility as the door opened and the men came in. Brian, Mr. Wickham, bringing up the rear. Elizabeth's heart leapt into her chest as she pulled herself upright and tried to appear breezy and sophisticated. Go time. They were introduced one at a time to the room in general, bowing politely with each address. Elizabeth felt her heart pound in her chest when Mr. Wickham's name was announced, and he smiled directly at her. She turned away, quickly, determined not to be affected by it. At that point, the card tables were brought out, and the rest of the party began deliberating over which game to join. Elizabeth took a seat in the corner, hoping against hope that no one would ask her to play. She had never played a card game with actual cards in her life, excepting, of course, Go Fish. This was probably not the time or place to announce that she currently held all three of the high scores for free sale on her phone. Mr. Wickham obviously found the feeling to be mutual, as he meandered over and took the chair opposite hers, drink in hand. Elizabeth felt her stomach tie itself in knots as she watched that dazzling smile of his do its best to melt her frosty exterior. Perfectly composed, she returned it politely. She was a veritable ice queen. Her eyes flitted across the room to where Lydia sat with cards in hand and was glaring at Elizabeth with envy. Miss Elizabeth, Mr. Wickham began, you are not a fan of cards? Elizabeth took her time returning his gaze. She gave him a cold look before replying, no, not really. Nor am I, to be sure. I would much rather engage in stimulating conversation than gambling. he returned unconvincingly, casting a wistful look over at the card tables. I'll just bet you do, Elizabeth retorted. She heard the irony in her words and laughed in spite of herself. Despite herself, sorry. Looking at Mr. Wickham, she saw he was grinning, and she blushed and dropped her gaze to her uneven nails. I could not help but notice from our chance meeting yesterday that you are acquainted with Mr. Bingley, Miss Elizabeth. I wonder if you could apprise me of some information. His expression faltered slightly. Pray tell, how far is Netherfield from Meryton? Elizabeth was so surprised by the question that she answered before she could decide against it. About 2 miles, I think. I see, Mr. Wickham replied, staring into his glass. And might you know how long exactly Mr. Darcy has been staying there? About a month, Elizabeth said firmly, and not taking her eyes from his face. Do you know him? I do, Wickham confirmed. His eyes drifted distractedly over at her sister's. We were very close once, truth be told. Elizabeth raised her eyebrows at him. You were aware, I take it, of his reaction to my presence in your party? He asked as he leaned forward, and when he saw her nod, added, Are you acquainted with Mr. Darcy as well? I suppose, in a way, you could say I have known him since I was 13. In that case, it is a wonder that we have not been acquainted before now. I myself have been connected with the Darcy family from infancy, Mr. Wickham divulged. Oh, I know it, Elizabeth sniffed. I know all about it. She sat back in her chair. You may not have known me very long, sir, but I know you very well. How intriguing, Mr. Wickham exclaimed. He gave her his most charming smile. I am most interested to learn the motives a young lady such as yourself would have to learn the history of a gentleman thoroughly before an introduction is even made. I do hope your education was pleasant and did my character credit. If you consider immorality a positive character trait, then yes, I suppose it did, Elizabeth said sarcastically, rolling her eyes at him. Wickham's smile faded. Oh yes, well, I am sure Darcy had wonderful things to say about my character, did he not? He muttered bitterly as he glanced around the room. Mr. Darcy said nothing to me. He didn't have to. I already know everything about what you did to him and his poor sister. Wickham's face reddened. He drew himself closer to Elizabeth and whispered, And what wrongdoings am I to be accused of, may I ask? Elizabeth leaned forward. Oh, sorry. He drew himself closer to Elizabeth and whispered, And what wrongdoings am I to be accused of, may I ask? Elizabeth leaned forward, her own cheeks pink with indignation. You took money away from Mr. Darcy. You took money from Mr. Darcy. I told you I was in a weird mood, I'm sorry. You gambled it all away, then had the nerve to come back to him years later and ask for more. When he rightly refused, you planned to get revenge by seducing and marrying his little sister. You broke her heart and would have ruined her reputation if Mr. Darcy had not stopped you. For a moment, they simply glared at each other as laughter and conversation filled the stony silence. Without breaking eye contact, Mr. Wickham slowly brought his face closer to hers as if to kiss her. Elizabeth's heart began to pound. He put his mouth right up to her ear and breathed, You believe you know, but you have no idea what actually occurred. Is that right? Elizabeth's voice wavered as she struggled to maintain her composure. His face was still dangerously close. It is. Wickham leaned back in his chair. You do not know me in the least. Then why don't you enlighten me? Elizabeth hissed, narrowing her eyes. Mr. Wickham's lips curved, but his eyes remained cold. I owe you no explanation that I am aware of. That may be, Elizabeth conceded, but if you don't give me a reason to think better of you, I will have no choice but to tell everyone in Meryton, including your commanding officer, my version of events. She leaned back and crossed her arms, and I'm sure he, as well as every woman in town, will be eager to avoid your acquaintance at all costs, don't you think? She felt her eyes well up with angry tears. I certainly wouldn't want anyone else to have their heart broken because of you. Mr. Wickham pursed his lips in contemplation. He studied her guardedly, as if deciding whether he could trust her. Checking the room once more to make sure no one was paying any attention to them, he dragged his chair closer to hers. If I confide in you, you must swear to me that you will not tell a single soul, especially Darcy, he said so quietly that she had to lean in close to hear him. That depends on what you're going to tell me, Elizabeth whispered back. If I feel it's something he needs to know, I will tell him. It is not something he need know, I assure you, Wickham maintained. It is not something that anyone need ever know. It would be the end of me. Now Elizabeth was so overcome with curiosity, she could not pull her eyes away from him, even when an explosion of laughter erupted from the card tables. What is it? Mr. Wickham sighed deeply. I'm in love with Mr. Darcy. Elizabeth stared at him without blinking. I know what you must be thinking. I doubt it, she declared, her lips curled upward into a smile. You mock me, he said sadly. I'm not mocking you, I promise, she defended. It's just that it makes total sense to me, actually, but it still doesn't explain anything. Mr. Wickham exhaled. Unfortunately, there is nothing I can say to excuse my conduct when Mr. Darcy's father died. I was young and foolish and broken-hearted. You see, we had been brought up together as close as brothers. It was when we were both fully grown that I realized my jealousy was a result of my affection for him. His irreproachable father, to whom I owe my advantageous youth. Here we go. Every time my laundry gets done, this pipe in my ceiling makes this noise. I'm so sorry. I don't know what it is. It's annoying. Anyway, I'll talk louder. Now I gotta shh. Okay. His irreproachable father, to whom I owe my advantageous youth, desired for me to become a clergyman. I knew I could never in good conscience do God's work while I wrestled with my own sin nature. When he died, I told Darcy that I did not desire the living that had been so graciously provided. I could not confess the truth as to why. He was so indignant, he bestowed upon me a significant sum of money to leave Derbyshire and never return. I now most ardently wish I had not accepted his offering. However, I was much aggrieved, and so I agreed to his demands. In my despair, I turned to drink in an effort to dull the pain and regrettably gambled away most of the money he had granted. 3 years later, I returned to Pemberley and attempted to ask for his forgiveness. I hoped to make amends by accepting the living and therefore honoring my godfather. However, he refused my apology and the living as well, and bid me leave. I respected his decision, though his actions fostered more suffering. I did not see nor hear of him for years after. Elizabeth found herself so completely engrossed in his story. He must have seen the sympathy in her eyes, because Mr. Wickham gave her a rueful smile. It all must sound ridiculous to a lady such as yourself. No, I feel your pain, believe me, she said. Mr. Darcy has been driving me crazy for practically all of my adult life. She looked down at her lap. So, what happened with Georgiana then? Ah, Miss Darcy. Mr. Wickham lamented. He glanced up at the ceiling. Where shall I begin? Well, let it first be said that she is not the blameless young lady she is proclaimed to be. It was Georgiana who approached myself at Ramsgate. After spending time in her company, she professed ardent love for me and implored me to elope with her. I was later to discover she was vexed with her brother for sending her to London and desired to escape his guardianship by any means necessary, so she might live a life free from propriety. You see, I was not the only one with an appetite for gambling. I was merely a means to an end for her. Indeed, I believe I was her object because she knew it would infuriate him to the greatest extent, considering our history. In a moment of weakness, I agreed to the elopement. My ambitions were for Darcy to forgive me entirely for the sake of his beloved sister, and that I would at the very least, be insured of his company for the remainder of our lives. It was contemptible. I know it now. I knew it then. I confessed I could not go through with it. I even made the grievous error of confiding in her my sentiments for her brother. When Darcy himself arrived a day early, in fear of his vexation, she fabricated her own version of events, convincing him that I was coercing her to elope, and that I was only in pursuit of her sizable fortune. After our previous interactions, he was all too willing to believe every word. When I confronted her, she threatened to inform her brother what I divulged to her in strictest confidence, should I ever relate to him the truth of her intentions. He took a deep breath. And that brings us to today, with my humiliation complete, as I have become a lowly foot soldier, with no hope of future ambitions. Elizabeth shook her head sadly, slowly. Could this be true? Her subconscious sure was putting its own twist on the original story. She had completely misunderstood and assumed the worst about him without even knowing the actual truth. Wickham wasn't a horrible excuse for a human being. He was just a sad, broken-hearted man that had let his grief control his actions. She had done the same thing on numerous occasions, hadn't she? She knew what it was to feel miserable due to unrequited love. Any residual anger she felt toward him melted away in that moment as she looked into his green eyes and saw herself reflected in them. I had no idea, Elizabeth mumbled softly. I'm so sorry I misjudged you. That's quite all right, Wickham assured her. I'm confident my reputation as a scoundrel in Derbyshire has been spread far and wide by this time. I hope perhaps it had not reached the good people of Meryton's ears just yet. Now that Darcy is spending the majority of his time here, I am certain it will only be a matter of time. It's a shame that you yourself couldn't just tell Mr. Darcy the truth about how you feel and clear your name. The truth would promote more misfortune than welfare, unfortunately, Mr. Wickham demurred. If my secret became common knowledge, I would be cast out of polite society forevermore. Therefore, I will continue to play the thespian, and hope that time will eradicate my solicitude. I won't tell anyone, I promise. I would be most grateful for that. He gave her a wan smile. At that moment, dinner was announced, and Mr. Wickham offered Elizabeth his arm. He escorted her into the dining room with the others. During the meal, Elizabeth watched as he flirted deftly with the rest of the women. He was flawlessly charming. She gave a small smile when the others laughed appreciatively at his witty banter, thinking to herself how difficult it must be for him to maintain this illusion of happiness. Though at the time she tried to convince herself otherwise, Elizabeth had been devastated for weeks when Brian had broken up with her, and although she did love him, she had never actually been in love with him. How much worse would it have been if she had? She was so angry with him for pretending to love her when he wished he was with someone else, nearly the entire time they were together. But really, how could she hate him for not being in love with her when she felt the same way about him? Didn't the fact that he waited so long to tell her the truth because he didn't want to hurt her prove how much he cared about her? Brian could have just as easily have dumped her as soon as James re-entered his life. She never once considered his feelings, only her own, and now Elizabeth felt terrible. When the evening was over and they were in the carriage on the way home, Elizabeth was grateful for Mr. Collins' ceaseless chatter. She was in no mood for conversation, especially on the subject of officers. She stared out the small window at the night sky, her sullenness unnoticed by everyone except Jane, who wisely chose not to address it. The next morning, Elizabeth escaped the confines of the house and took refuge behind a row of boxwood hedges to ensure her privacy so she could dissect everything Mr. Wickham had said the night before. If what he had said was true, and she really believed he was telling the truth, it changed everything. At the very least, it changed how she felt about him. She could honestly say that she had never actually been in love with anyone before. How hard must it be? How hard it must be to genuinely love someone and know that it would never be reciprocated. The similarities between Mr. Wickham and Brian were undeniable. However, Brian was fortunate enough to end up with the person that he loved, whereas Mr. Wickham never would. And all because of the demands his society placed upon him to hide his true self. Mr. Darcy strikes again. He had been creating unrealistic expectations in romance for over 200 years. The sound of hooves, approaching drew Elizabeth's attention away from her thoughts. She peeked through the leaves and saw Mr. Bingley riding toward the house. Smiling at the sight of him, she stood up and brushed off her dress, casually strolling out from behind the hedges. When he saw her, he grinned and threw himself down from his horse, landing effortlessly beside it. Of course he did. "Miss Elizabeth," he cried, "how glad I am to see you. I was addressing invitations for the ball and decided I would deliver yours personally." Elizabeth curtsied, then took the envelope from his outstretched hand and saw her name scrawled across the front. "The ball at Netherfield? I can't wait. I have been longing for the opportunity to beg your forgiveness for my abrupt departure in Meryton. I desired to speak with you, but alas, it was not meant to be." "That's okay," Elizabeth said quickly. "I am so looking forward to the ball. I wouldn't miss it for the world." He grinned again, and she suddenly felt lightheaded. Those dimples should come with a warning label. "Please view responsibly." "Would you like to come inside, Mr. Bingley? I think I could figure out how to make us some tea." She began to walk back to the house. "Actually," Mr. Bingley vacillated. I cannot talk today. Vacillated. "I was wondering if Miss Bennet might be at home. I was hoping to procure her opinion on a particular matter." He dragged the toe of his boot across the ground before him. Elizabeth felt her heart flip-flop inside her chest. "Oh, I think she is just inside. I will go get her," she faltered, and paused awkwardly before turning toward the door. "Thank you." He appeared deeply uncomfortable as she left him standing alone. Elizabeth walked slowly through the house, half-heartedly looking for Jane. What could Mr. Bingley have to say to her? He was going to ask her for the first 2 dances, wasn't he? "Well, isn't this what you wanted? For him to want Jane?" her brain reprimanded her. "Yes," Elizabeth answered reluctantly. So why did she suddenly feel like telling him Jane was already spoken for? She could simply convince Mr. Collins to ask her sister, leaving herself free. She found her sister sewing in the drawing room, and her nefarious plotting dissolved into resignation. "Jane," she said matter-of-factly, "Mr. Bingley is waiting outside. He wants to speak to you in private." Jane lifted her eyes in surprise. "Mr. Bingley? Are you certain?" "Fairly certain, seeing as I was just speaking with him myself," Elizabeth grumbled, then immediately regretted her tone. Jane left the room quickly. Elizabeth collapsed into her vacant chair and swung her legs over the arm. She considered eavesdropping, but there didn't seem to be a good reason since she already knew what he wanted. She stared out of the window, trying not to think about the two of them together. Then she jumped when she saw Mr. Collins enter the room. "Miss Elizabeth," he bubbled. I was just looking for you. Might I have a word? Elizabeth cringed and sat up straight. Oh, good God, is he about to propose right here, right now? How could she have been so stupid as to allow herself to be alone in a room when Mr. Collins was in the house? Ugh. She thought wildly of an excuse to escape when she saw Jane come back through the door. Jane, she cried. What did Mr. Bingley have to say? Jane's eyes traveled slowly from her sister's face to Mr. Collins and back again in confusion. He asked for the first 2 dances at the ball. Ball? Mr. Collins echoed eagerly. There is to be a ball? Yes, our neighbor Mr. Bingley is hosting a ball at Netherfield, Jane confirmed. You were included in the invitation as well, Mr. Collins. Although I dare say you do not consider dancing an acceptable form of amusement? She gave Elizabeth a wink. On the contrary, my dear cousin, he chirped. This type of ball, given by a true gentleman and to respectable people, is exactly the sort of amusement of which I am exceedingly delighted to participate in. I am confident Lady Catherine would not object to my partaking in a dance or two. Indeed, I would like to take this opportunity to request the honor of your hand, Miss Elizabeth, for the first 2 dances especially. Mortified, Elizabeth stared at Mr. Collins with her mouth gaped open. As her dance card was at present pitifully bare, she knew she had no choice but to accept. She felt nauseated. Was she really going to have to spend the first 2 dances of the Netherfield ball with Mr. Collins? Oh, how did this happen? She knew it happened in the book, but thought since nothing so far seemed to be following the book, she might be able to avoid it, and Jane would now be dancing with Mr. Bingley. Sigh. At least the 2 dances would be over quickly. There was no need to let this small setback ruin the entire ball. And of course, there was still Mr. Darcy. The thought of dancing with Mr. Darcy at the Netherfield ball cheered Elizabeth considerably. She decided to go for a walk. When she noticed Mr. Bingley still lingering outside, she asked him if he would like to join her, and he happily accepted, his glorious dimples working their magic once more. Side effects may include euphoria and memory loss. And that's the end of chapter 10. Moving on.